All right, so continuing our conversation on fantasy genres. This time we're going to talk about sword and sorcery and heroic fantasy, medieval Arthurian fantasy, historical fantasy, and comic fantasy. Sword and sorcery and heroic fantasy, that can run along the same vein as your high fantasy or epic fantasy. It has a lot of the same underlying themes there. It has a focus definitely on a heroic character, and it's usually an action-packed adventure. It usually has very powerful heroes and very dark villains. Some examples of this could be Conan the Barbarian, the Black Company. Witcher could also be considered sword and sorcery and heroic fantasy. Medieval fantasy, Arthurian fantasy. These are inspired by the elements of the medieval setting, and even inspired by the folklore surrounding King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table and the sorcerer Merlin. So our example of the Mists of Avalon, which is basically an Arthurian saga, but it's told through the eyes of the female characters. So it's that classic story, but has a twist on it, very similar to the fairy tale retellings. Also, I would consider Game of Thrones is also, it pulls on that medieval setting. And you could also continue along the Arthurian vein with works such as Merlin, Queens of Camelot, and even Sword in the Stone can kind of fall into that category. Historical fantasy is one that I write in. My Ruin Master Saga is historical fantasy. It's actually a lot of fun to write, so if you get a chance, go out and check it out. It is my favorite. Start with Dusk. Historical fantasy basically kind of blends historical settings and even true factual historical events, giving them a magical or supernatural element to kind of twist the story a little bit. Examples like Outlander definitely falls in this historical fantasy category. The Poppy War, which I've not read, but it's on my to-be-read list. City of Brass, also on my list. Haven't read it. And Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. I added this one in there just because I know that the premise was absolutely ridiculous, but if you actually look at the story, how it was woven with actual factual events was rather impressive, to be completely honest. I know people kind of think it's kind of a joke, but it's actually kind of masterfully crafted, I guess you could say. It's definitely interesting, to say the least. Comic fantasy. This one was hard for me to find examples of it, but they do exist and they are out there. Discworld and Good Omens would be a couple of examples. They tend to be not so much comedic, but it's very satirical, kind of pulling on parts of the genre and exaggerating them. So it kind of combines comedy and satire with fantasy elements, which can be kind of interesting to read. It's definitely a different spin on the fantasy genre, which is what makes it popular and why some people read in that particular genre. So those are 4 more genres. And next month, we're going to sit down and talk about the last 4 on my list, which is science fantasy, grimdark fantasy, gothic and dark fantasy, and the New World, as the next fantasy genres for discussion.